Satan comes to him in three very specific temptations. All of the gospel writers give us those very three. And the first one is this. Satan comes to him and says to him in a very straightforward way. He says, why don't you change these stones into bread? Because if you change these stones into bread, the whole world will follow you. Satan makes a fallacious assumption. The fallacious assumption he makes is that if God would only be the constant miracle worker, if God would satisfy all of our intellectual needs, all of our material needs, that the whole world will turn and follow him. Listen to me. Time and time and time again, we learn in history that some of the most vile indecencies, some of the most criminal acts have not come from men and women whose stomachs were empty, but from men and women whose stomachs were full. It has not come from people who were uneducated and bereft of understanding. Some of the vilest acts perpetrated upon humanity have come from those who were the most powerful and had access to the greatest amount of learning. Take, for example, the life of Joseph Stalin, that 5'4" murderous Georgian brigand in the Kremlin who exterminated 15 million of his own people. Stalin was once upon a time a seminary student. And he decided to turn his back upon God and seek and grasp at this power to rule this empire. And the last act that Joseph Stalin did, and by the way, when he went into power, one of his determined goals was to exterminate anything religious in that land. And when he was lying on his deathbed, his daughter Svetlana Stalin told this to Malcolm Muggeridge. And Malcolm Muggeridge, in the few moments I had with him in his home in Sussex, England, 7 months before he died, brought this conversation up repeatedly when I was there. He said, you know, Svetlana was in my home, and we were here doing a production on the BBC on the life of her father, Joseph. And he said, Mr. Zacharias, 3 times in the week that she was with me, she told me the same episode, that as her father lay dying and was hallucinating, thinking wolves were attacking him. Think of this for a moment. The last thing that Joseph Stalin actually did was half sit up in bed, clench his fist towards the heavens one more time. His head fell back on this pillow and he was gone. Brilliant, powerful, full stomach, all the knowledge that he could have had of world history at his fingertips, and yet slaughtering his own people. You see, Satan was wrong in his assumption that if you satisfy people materially, they will turn and follow you. That is not true. I can tell you that time and time again, God can satisfy you intellectually, but the ultimate problem in your heart and mind is not intellectual, it is moral. It is not intellectual, it is moral. I will very easily sustain this for you. That is our life now, going from campus to sustain that the assumptions of materialistic worldviews, the assumptions of naturalism are intellectually incoherent. They have not found a philosophical theory that can coherently explain the very naturalistic sciences and the assumptions that are implicit in them, as if they can explain human existence and all of its mystery. He made a wrong assumption that if you only give people material satisfaction, they will be fully convinced that you are the answer to life and they will follow you. Change these stones into bread and they will follow you. The biography of Muggeridge is a very painful biography to read. But I do not know of too many lives and writers who more shaped my own thinking in trying to come to grips with the human heart than Malcolm Muggeridge's life itself. In fact, there are many times when you read his biography, you're almost tempted to shut that book and say, I can't take any more of a life that became so decrepit. But he would be the one to concede. He was an awful living man, lived with a lot of filth in his mind, lived with a lot of indulgence. When he died, I think it was 93 or so that he died, or 91, they eulogized him and described him as possibly the greatest English journalist of this century. One-time editor of Punch magazine, making millions laugh while there was no laughter in his own heart. Muggeridge tells this story in his autobiography, 2 volumes of it. First is called The Green Stick, A Chronicle of Wasted Years. The second one is called The Infernal Grove. Never got to complete the 3rd volume. But in that first volume, I believe he tells this story. He was in India, living there for some years at a school of journalism as a young man. And one day he came out of the building in the early hours of the morning. He was all alone at sunrise. The building stood by a riverbank. He was going for his morning swim. Way out in the distance, he saw an Indian woman beginning to disrobe far away to get into the water for her bath. Muggeridge began to eye her from the distance and wondered whether this may be the moment for him to cross certain lines in his own belief. And the seduction became stronger in his imagination, and he started to swim towards her. He says his mind embattled, telling him, no, this is wrong, this is wrong. On the other hand, thinking he could make a meager offer to her and she would be able to take his proposal. After all, she was a village woman. He was a rich man from another country. He'd be able to make the proposal. And as he struggled with this, he said he swam harder and harder because he knew what he was going to do was wrong. But he persuaded himself this was his moment to cross the line. As he came closer to her, she became fearful because she wondered who this person was coming to violate that privacy of hers. And as he came within a foot or two of her, she raised her hands to cover herself. To her own shock, saw this gentleman, a white man, emerge from the water. And the reason I say that is very specific, because nobody would have wanted to get close to her. As shocking as it was to her to see a foreigner come that close, it was even more shocking to him when he came within a foot of her to realize that she'd put her hands up to cover herself, protect herself. He was looking into the face of a leper. The fingers were all worn away. The nostrils were all gone, the eyebrows and eyelashes. He said she looked almost like an animal peering out from her cheekbones. And he said, and I looked at her, nauseated for the moment. And I thought to myself, what a lecherous woman, when I hung my head in shame and realized it wasn't the lecherous woman that was the problem. It was the lecherous mind with which I was living. For the first time, he saw his heart under God's microscope for him, and he hated what he had seen. You see, ladies and gentlemen, with all of our education today, and all of our sophisticated theories today, we have tried to explain this rebellion in the heart. We have tried to give it euphemistic terms and tried to find other descriptions of who we really are, when the Bible makes it clear that what is contained in the human heart, if it were ever exposed and understood, would bring every one of us to our knees when we see ourselves as God sees us. Even a secular, atheistic psychologist, Hobart Maurer, who died in 1982 having committed suicide at the age of 75, one-time professor at Yale, one-time professor at Harvard, one-time president of the American Psychological Association, in 1960, in an article in the American Psychologist, says this, and listen please. He says, for several decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus and acclaimed our liberation from sin as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered that to be free from sin, that is to have the excuse of being sick rather than being sinful, is to court the danger of also becoming lost. This danger, I believe, says Maurer, is betokened by the widespread interest in existentialism which we are presently witnessing. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral, and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deepest sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics themselves find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? And what does living really mean? Imagine an atheist, a secular thinker who would not have given any credence to the scriptures, makes the comment that in losing this transcendent connection of wrongness, we have lost our sense of being and our deepest sense of destiny and identity. Do you know what Maurer followed up with this article? He said he received more angry mail from fellow psychologists than on any other subject he had ever written. You see, this resistance, this bold-faced denial that the heart is wrong stands fundamentally opposed to what the Bible teaches, that the heart is wrong and the heart is in need of mending. Was it not Muggeridge who also went on to say that the depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable reality, but at the same time the most intellectually resisted fact? It is the most empirically verifiable reality, at the same time the most intellectually resisted fact. One of the great moments in Holy Scripture comes in that encounter with the patriarch Jacob, who had cheated his brother, robbed him of his birthright, and run away from home at the instigation of his mother, stole the birthright, and he was gone. Years have now gone by, and he's become a wealthy man. And the moment of confrontation is going to come. Joseph is going to meet up with Esau the next day. And he knows there's going to be trouble because he suspects Esau's been hunting for him. And there was going to be warfare between his group and Esau's group, and he didn't want it. So all that night he spends in prayer. And the Bible describes it with fascinating poignancy. It says this: he wrestled with God. He wrestled with God. And at one moment he says to God, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And of all the questions God in his infinite knowledge could have asked Jacob, he stops Jacob for a moment and says, what is your name? Why did he ask him that? As if God didn't know his name. Do you know why he asked him that? Because years before, when Jacob had stolen the blessing from his blind father, Isaac, he claimed to be Esau. When Isaac had said, who are you? He said, I am Esau. Isaac says, you don't sound like my son Esau. He said, no, believe me, I really am your son Esau. Will you give me the blessing of the firstborn? And before his blind father, he claimed to be somebody he was not and stole the blessing. Now he was standing before an all-seeing God and wants the blessing, and God says to him, who are you? Jacob pauses and says, you've got me. You've got me. My name is Jacob. God says to him, now that you have admitted who you are, I will make somebody great out of you. I will make a great nation out of you. Jacob walked with a limp the rest of his life as a reminder of that wrestling episode, but with his heart held high because he knew the promise of God. Sir, if you will bring that heart before God and admit before him who you really are on the inside, he has promised to make something great out of your life when you admit to the reality that you have been in rebellion against him. Please understand me here. I want to make a point here that I've not made behind the pulpit before, but I want you to follow me because this is so important in a mixed audience like this. People often say something like, what about all the good things I've done? What about all the good people in this world? So first of all, let me say this. Jesus did not come into this world to make bad people good. He came into this world to make dead people live. Those who are dead to God, to make them alive to God. So let me just clear that. But secondly, let me say this. Being like God in image of goodness is not the same thing as being near God in approach of relationship. Being like God in reflecting God's image with a lot of good deeds. C.S. Lewis gives an illustration of being at the top of a mountain and looking at your home village down there. He says there may be some times where you are actually closer to home geographically, but you have to move farther away in your approach to the home before you get down there. Some people in their image may think they are closer, but in their approach they are farther. And some people in the approach may seem geographically farther away, but they're actually closer to getting home. And what I'm saying to you is that Christ, in telling us that the fundamental problem is not material but spiritual, There are many good people in this world, but it is not our goodness that brings us to God. It is the fact that we are dead, far away from Him. And in all of that goodness, we may be reflecting His image, but in our approach, we may be still far from Him, not coming the way in which He has invited us. So I end this first temptation with the simple conclusion like this. When Satan says to him, coming to the intellect, change these stones into bread and the world will follow you, Jesus says, no, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Humanity's problem is not material, it is spiritual.